I think we should start. First of all, I screwed up the layout tonight, or the timing, because I wanted to publish the video on the change of venue with enough time for people to watch it before the stream so that they could, get updated. But I screwed it up. Let's start with that, and we're going to work into case still, because I think those two stories are, when we talk about, criminal justice reform or prison reform, and this is what we see in the world, we can get cynical and we can get a little depressed. What's the guy's name? Thomas Caldwell is one of the first, or apparently the first individual of the January 6th riot gone wild to have been arrested on felony charges, conspiracy, and very serious charges that carry serious jail time. He filed a motion for change of venue. I don't know, a couple days ago, whatever. It's a lengthy motion and it's very well drafted. But like I said in my video, the whole irony of these motions for change of venue, like we've seen in Chauvin's case, is you're asking the judge in the venue to change the venue on the basis that the venue is going to be incapable of being impartial. We saw what happened in Chauvin. I expect the same thing to happen here, but you're basically telling a judge that the venue is so tainted, we need another one. And you're asking that judge to say yes to it when that judge might take that as a challenge to say, no, the venue is going to be just fine. You sit tight and deal with it. Bottom line, the motion alleges that people in DC have been traumatized by this event, by the response, by the government measures, by the curfew, that they have been, that they hated Trump before this, and now they're going to look for any excuse to punish Trump supporters, that this is, middle America versus East and West Coast America, and that there is no chance for this individual under these circumstances of getting a fair trial in DC if it were ever possible in the first place. When have you seen a case where a motion for a change of venue has been granted in recent memory?
They actually cite two of them. One of them included someone that was alleged to have 9/11 connections, and the New York City federal court recognized that he could not get a fair trial with an impartial jury in New York City, given how traumatic that event was. And I forget what the second case was that they also cited, but was another case where, due to the nature of the event's impact and the pretrial publicity concerning the potential defendants, that they couldn't get a fair trial. So, I mean, this goes back to the show that The Fugitive was based on, the seminal case. I think it's Dr. Shepard. That was the U.S. Supreme Court did recognize venue, needing to be transferred where pretrial publicity had a disparate prejudicial effect. As a general rule, what happened was the U.S. Supreme Court in the Enron cases allowed Houston to be a jury pool in that case, and that basically undermined the right to transfer venue because of it. So I think they're absolutely right on the law and right on the facts. The key question is, as you note, one of the core problems with both recusal motions and venue transfer motions in America is that you're asking the abusive venue to declare itself abusive, just like you're asking the conflicted judge to declare themselves partial. And that's a very hard thing to do. They really should assign it to a different court. They should have a different court handle the venue transfer issues than the venue itself that's being subject to it. Now,
how could you do that, though? How could you ask a different court to adjudicate on that issue?
That has to be a rule change. That has to be the courts doing it themselves, or Congress or the respective state legislature changing those rules. Now, like a lot of states do have a right of disqualification that's automatic of judges. I think that should be applicable in the federal court system as well. Because it's just almost every recusal motion is denied, almost every motion to transfer venue is denied, and that's a problem. Now, he has unusually strong facts here. I think there's one limitation, which is he should have done polling. It's a common problem of these lawyers everywhere. They don't understand the value of public opinion polling by somebody that's good at what they do, someone like Richard Barris, and to compare and contrast the communities, to take a look at the District of Columbia and what its jury pool would say, what prejudices it may have, what pretrial biases it may have versus the Western District of Virginia. Because he has unusual strong facts here, and that many of the charges actually originate from conduct that exclusively took place.
So that's in the Western District of Virginia. Two of the four charges which allege that he used his computer to communicate with the Oath Keepers, allege that this occurred in the Western Virginia. First thing is a matter of fact. Do we know if this individual, in fact, has any ties to the Oath Keepers to begin with?
Well, one of the things he does very well, and here I think in part he's slightly arguing in the court of public opinion, though the media is not going to cover it extensively. He uses the motion as a good opportunity to document in detail both how the prosecutors and members of law enforcement and the press have conspired to spread a wide range of false facts about him in particular and about these defendants in general. So, like, he was one of those people that was accused of wanting to, gas congressmen, kill congressmen, kidnap congressmen. All of that is false. It was always false. You could guess that from the get-go. But now even the government concedes it was, and yet that was the allegations made about him in the first weeks and months of the indictments. And there's many people who still believe it, that believe those lies. Not only did none of the rioters kill anyone, the only person who was killed directly by a police officer. Other people had health emergencies, but they still haven't shown any connection to the riots to that. And then no causal connection. And there was no pre-existing plan. That they figured that out. He had a nice phrase. I think he called it a colonoscopic review of all of the technology, of all the data. And after they looked at it, what the government found was there was no pre-existing conspiracy to attack the Capitol at all. This guy doesn't appear to have the connections to or the role in Oath Keepers that they alleged. And so basically, this guy has been lied about, destroyed, and defamed throughout the D.C., especially in the press, but throughout the country, but particularly impactful in D.C. The other point is he's using Biden's arming having the National Guard there for almost 6 months, having the mayor issuing curfews and states of emergency, and he's wisely using those facts. He's saying, if you're in D.C., you've been traumatized and terrorized by this event. Even more impactful, frankly, than 9/11 was on New York City. Because of the scope and scale of the action that took place in the months afterwards. They didn't shut down New York City. They didn't station the army there for 6 months.
And that's the interesting thing about 9/11 is that the people made a concerted effort to get back to normal life, to go on and to prove that they're resilient and they can get back to normal life without letting the incident define and cripple the nation. Whereas now that we see this playing out and we can go back and sort of assess it with fresh eyes, it really looks like the exact opposite was being done on January with this incident, is that they were deliberately trying to post facto, almost retroactively traumatize everyone based on an event which we lived the day of. We know what happened the day of, and then they spent months after the event trying to retroactively traumatize people with this and turn it into something that some people are going to say it was never and was not in their response, which itself is enough to traumatize people after the fact. And so it is interesting. They try to equate it to 9/11, but even in 9/11, people were trying to get back to normal. Whereas in this, it seems like everyone from the media to the government's response was trying to traumatize people on a going forward basis.
Precisely. And he does a very good job documenting and detailing that to a great degree, that basically that it is likely the case that many of the DC jurors feel traumatized, feel terrified, believe that he was part of a broad conspiracy to assault the Capitol, to kidnap, kill, and gas congressmen, and none of which is true. And consequently, there's no way he can get a fair trial in a jury pool that was already contaminated, as the lawyer notes, because of the extensive political prejudice concerning Trump supporters in the District of Columbia. And so in that dynamic, his point is there's just not a possible, fair, partial, impartial jury pool that can be produced in the District of Columbia. Now, I would have gone further. Two things. I would have used this rhetorical analogy. I would have said trying the January 6th defendants in the District of Columbia would be like trying Martin Luther King and his supporters in Bull Connor's Birmingham, and has about as good a chance as a fair trial as the defendant got in To Kill a Mockingbird. And to make those historical analogies. In the Snipes case, when I moved to transfer venue for a range of reasons in order to try to get fair jury selection, I compared it to the Peculiar Institution, which the lawyer who helped draft it he kind of went nuts after I made that comparison. I was like, you got to ratchet this up. You can't ratchet it down. And so I think it's a good motion. The one limitation, the one complaint I would have is the failure to use data, because I can almost guarantee you they would show substantial differences, obviously not only between the partisan demographics of the Western District of Virginia and the District of Columbia, but also just an overt prejudice. People who believe things about the defendants, the January 6th defendants in D.C., that is not nearly as commonly believed in the Western District of Virginia. You need to give data to really force these judges to take account for it. The other thing is I would add a motion to disqualify every judge in the District of Columbia. I don't believe a judge. It's the same logic. The same reason why the jury pool can't be impartial is the same reason why no federal judge in D.C. can be impartial.
You mentioned this on Barris, and it's a great point, is that every judge in D.C. will view this as an attack on their institution, on themselves, on them as individuals. And how can they possibly be partial in adjudicating on an attack which targeted them as individuals? And I want to just bring this one up while we're on the subject. BlackRock Beacon says, I was in D.C. on the 6th covering events. As someone who spent over a decade in the military, combat arms, fighting actual insurgents, calling what happened an insurrection is like calling a soapbox derby an F1 Grand Prix. So, but it's an interesting point, Robert, that you mentioned on Richard Barris. Is like, yeah, there should be no judge who can be capable of doing this because this was an attack on them if it is what everyone says it was. But how do you, I mean, has anything like that ever been done? A blanket disqualification of all judges in a jurisdiction?
It's usually been done when the judges have some sort of conflict with the personality involved. So like so you'll see judges. I had a case where all the judges in an entire county disqualified themselves because they knew the lawyers on the other side. So things like that. Well, actually, they knew both sides of lawyers, but that's another story. But and so it legally, there's good basis for it. My reasoning is this: even if it's a complete uphill battle to get the judges to disqualify themselves, it highlights the partiality and prejudice that everybody else outside the proceedings can see. And it forces in my view, there's almost never a downside to moving to disqualify a judge if you have any fair, reasonable grounds to do so, because it puts pressure on the judge to actually follow the law. That even if the judge denies your motion, the judge now realizes, okay, that this is how I'm perceived. I'm not perceived as some noble advocate. I'm perceived by at least some part of the community as a partisan advocate. And the judiciary, it's what I said about the Chauvin trial. The legal system was on trial there. Well, the federal judicial process and legal process is on trial in the January 6th cases. Can they afford? I mean, what we saw in the Chicago 7 cases was no Chicago judge could give a fair trial, and their denial of those motions ultimately hurt them on appeal because people got to witness the absurdity of the proceedings and the prejudice and partiality that inflamed those proceedings. And so I think that's a very good motion brought for good grounds. He's fighting a very uphill battle to get any relief or remedy directly, but what it can do, not only does it defend his clients in the court of public opinion, but it puts pressure on the court system to do a much more thorough, diligent jury selection process that can give him whatever thin chance he has at a fair trial and sets up an appeal. And I mean, the other advantage, he didn't say it, but going to the Fourth Circuit, or the Western District of Virginia, you get a different court of appeals to preside over the case. And the Fourth Circuit, with all its problems, is still better than the D.C. Circuit, particularly on these cases. Because, I mean, these judges have made it clear, and I would have cited and quoted a lot of the judges' own statements, some of the other judges' statements. They've made statements in these cases when they denied bail on completely unconstitutional grounds, in my view, where they made clear they thought this was an attack on them. And I would just highlight that. Say, like, judges feel that this Capitol Hill attack, based on how the press covered it, based on how Biden administration responded to it, based on how the mayor in D.C. reacted to it, was that this was an assault on them personally. And how in the world, if you think this was a group of people who was out to harm you personally at some level, how can you possibly be an impartial judge? And most importantly, the legal standard doesn't require impartiality. It requires the perception of impartiality, that there be no doubt as to your impartiality. And I don't think any DC judge can really say that they have no doubt that they'll be impartial in these proceedings.
They raised one of the arguments that, they should be tried by a jury of their peers, and it would be more appropriate in West Virginia than DC.
Western District of Virginia.
Western District of Virginia, I'm sorry. But what strength is there to that argument where you say, like, okay, well, that's basically like saying, try me in a place where I think I have more friends than a place where I think I don't. And what is the limit? What's the legal scope of a jury of your peers? Does it mean people who are like you politically, religiously, ethnically, or does it just mean the citizens of the district in which this is being tried?
Well, a federal judge in New York dismissed a case recently because it was transferred from one part of New York to a suburban part of New York on the grounds that the new demographics of the new district did not comport with where the crime was committed and thus violated his right to an impartial grand jury. So the same logic would apply here. Now, people often think, because of the Magna Carta, that our jury trial right is a right to a trial of your peers. It's not. Our constitutional provision doesn't say peers. It says a right to an impartial, the way it's been interpreted, impartial jury, free of prejudice, that represents a fair section of the community where the crime occurred. Here, there's two different communities where they claim the crime occurred. They claim it took place in the Western District of Virginia in part, and took place in the District of Columbia in part. And my view is that he could have fleshed that argument out a little better. I got the idea that the Western District of Virginia doesn't have the same political prejudices that the District of Columbia does, doesn't feel like they were the direct target of the assault like what the District of Columbia does. And that the Western District of Virginia still has a lot of demographic diversity of what would reflect sort of an American jury pool. But that argument could have been fleshed out a lot better. There isn't really an argument in favor of peerage jury trials in America. That just isn't part of our constitutional provision. It's commonly believed, but mythical.
All right, and before we move on, predictions. What are you thinking is going to happen with this motion?
Unless he's got a rare DC judge, it will be denied. But it will set up a grounds by which not only they have an appeal, but will put more pressure on the judge to be more impartial in these proceedings. It also is a great opportunity to educate the judge at how much, if the judge has any of these same prejudices that the jury pool has about this defendant or what took place on January 6th, this was an excellent opportunity to expose that. So it can't hurt his client. It can only help his client, but I don't think he'll get the legal relief or remedy because it's a high hurdle and because the DC courts so far have shown no ability to be impartial in these proceedings.
I think they want it, and they're not going to let go of it. And I don't know who would pry it from their hands. What was I going to say about that? On the other hand, I think this motion was drafted quite clearly for public consumption, if not entirely, at least in large part. And my only fear, concern, knowing the way the media works, that no one's going to cover this and go into the details of this story in order for people like not necessarily like myself, but others who may not be familiar with all of the details, who might still be stuck up on the headlines of Jan 6, will not know the follow-up or the fallout. And so I think it's great to get the story out there, but you're not going to see Brian Stetler or Rachel Maddow getting into the thick of this motion to illustrate all of the headlines that panned out to not only not be true, but to be outright false in some respects. And we don't need to go over them. People are still being detained, Robert, from Jan 6 without parole or bond.
Yeah, and some may be at this point and not only that, they're being detained under rather horrific conditions. Not only have they apparently been repeatedly subject to assaults, but many of them apparently are in isolation. So I mean, it's what we internationally define as torture is what's happening to many of these defendants.